black lights and Bruce burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal, and we are honored today to be joined by Dr. Johnnetta Cole. The list of accolades after a career of service are immense. She is the former director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art, President Emerita of Spelman College and Bennett College, Professor Emerita of Emory University, where she retired as a Presidential Distinguished Professor of Anthropology, Women's Studies, and African American Studies, and currently the President of the National Council of Negro Women. Among her books, there's All American Women, Lines That Divide, Ties That Bind, Dream the Boldest Dreams and Other Lessons of Life, and Gender Talk, the struggle for women's equality in African American communities, which she wrote with Beverly. Thank you for joining us here today.
My joy to be with you, Brother Mark.
I want to start with Gender Talk, a book that was published some time ago, well before Me Too, and so many of the things that we've seen that have gone on. But in many ways, a book that helped gestate a conversation and a sensibility in Black communities around gender disparities and inequality, patriarchy, misogyny. How do you feel about that book now, after a few years after its publication?
Well, the first thing I want to say is a praise song for my colleague, sister friend, Beverly. I can't imagine writing that book without Beverly. We just have an incredibly close relationship and shared way of looking at the world as Black feminists. Now, I will tell you, when we wrote that book, Beverly and I imagined we were going to get kicked out of the race. But the reception to the book, not just among African American women, but if I can use this language, among our allies, African American men, was really very uplifting. Obviously, as you've just indicated, so much has happened since then. One would wish that we hadn't seen it, in a sense, coming, that we hadn't rung some bells of alarm. But I'm sitting here thinking about James Baldwin, who said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed that is not faced. And so I'm sure my closest friend in the world, Beverly the good professor, would join me in saying, if we had even a teeny bit to do with inviting us, calling us, almost demanding us to face issues around gender and gender inequality, if we had even a little contribution to that, we feel mighty good.
I think about the work that Dr. Guy Sheftel has done around the Women's Resource Center at Spelman. I mean, it literally has trained a few generations of Black women scholars who themselves have become Black feminists. Talk a little bit about how important it was to have these learning laboratories that were Spelman and also Bennett, over these years, right? Not only the fact that they were historically Black colleges and universities, but specifically institutions that were geared towards the training of Black women.
Well, when we think about that long trajectory of Black women as educators, as activists, Beverly is among those who's reminded us that it goes so far back. That's, of course, what she hoped to accomplish in doing Words of Fire,
right,
to remind us of that long, her story of black feminists. But certainly the training, the educating, the awakening, if I can use that word, of black women as feminists is so essential for our movement forward. Now, I'm going to use some other words here, and you know them. If you educate a man, you educate a man. If you educate a woman, you educate a nation. Now, there's a kind of double-edged sword there, because I think at the base of that saying is the understanding that at least up until now, women of all hues are the major socializers of the nation in the sense of the next generation. I'd like to imagine that that is something more equally shared between whoever is in that household, of whatever gender identity. That's not work that any one individual ought to do. But it is still the case that we women, at least at this point in history and her story, are major socializers of the coming generation. And so when we prepare black women feminists, that means we're having an influence so far beyond that individual.
Let me talk about your career for a moment, because even as you talk so lovingly about the importance of educating women and what the impact is on a broader community, you know, you were born and raised in a period of time where that was not always the option for black women. You begin your career at Fisk, get a degree from Oberlin, and then pursue a PhD in anthropology from Northwestern at a time when that might not have been the ideal choice, the best choice, and clearly not the most encouraged choice for a young black woman. Talk about what you experienced in those early days.
Well, first of all, I've got to simply acknowledge how horrific the environment was in which I grew up. Simultaneously, how extraordinarily lovingly and preparatory it was. That is to say, I grew up at a time of two narratives. The main one by the privileged, dominant society of Southern white folk told me it didn't matter what I did. I could only go so far, because inherently I was inferior to anyone who was white. But I grew up in a family that said, you're not going for that. There's no truth in it. You will go as far as your efforts, and of course they added your fate, will take you. And they then said, you've got a responsibility to go against that primary or main narrative. So I got to call a few names here. I grew up the great-granddaughter of Abraham Lincoln, Lewis. Like so many black men, as you know, Brother Mark, during that period, named for the great emancipator, all right? But A.L. Lewis was a mighty force, a third-grade education. Went on to become Florida's first black millionaire by joining with other black men to form Florida's first insurance company. Now, I'm raising my great-grandfather's name in part so that I can say that one of his closest friends was the legendary Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. So what I didn't hear from A.L. Lewis and my immediate family, I heard, if you can believe this, directly from Dr. Bethune. when I was knee-high to a duck, I would go with my mom to Bethune-Cookman College, where her sorority sisters were, teaching at Bethune-Cookman. And if the good Dr. Bethune was in her office, my sister and I had the almost unspeakable, it was so exquisite, honor of being with her. So by the time I get to Fisk in an early entrance program, didn't really want to go. I'm 15 years old. Got these pushy black parents, you know. They believed in education like the devil believes in sin. So I get pushed to Fisk, end up at Oberlin, end up discovering anthropology. I'm going to take us all the way back to A.L. Lewis and Mary McLeod Bethune, because getting that PhD was embedded in the notion that I had to be of service.
Yeah.
That's what race men and race women were about, service.
This idea of service, as I looked at your biography, there's so many times where, you know, for lack of a better way to describe it, you could have gotten off the field. And it's not a question about legacy, because your legacy would have been intact. But every time folks call, you know, you go back to service at a time when, you know, you don't have to. And in some ways, when I think about your generation of race people, it's a dying breed, right? I'm not sure that this ethic of service has been passed down to the extent that your generation understood how important this service was.
Yeah, I wish I could push back, but I can't. You know, I learn every day from the generation that I respectfully and affectionately call the young'uns. And at the risk of doing what you and I in the classroom say you never do, make these sweeping statements, I'm gonna make one. Let's edit. Too many in that generation of young'uns don't get what service is about. They see themselves, they love themselves, they want to move, all of which is not to be questioned. But what Mary McLeod Bethune said, what all of those women in the Negro Women's Club movement said, by their signature line was, lift as you climb. So there's nothing wrong with climbing up. We want you to succeed. But you've got to do some paying forward. You've got to mentor. You've got to go and work in a homeless shelter or one where women have experienced the most unbearable notion of violence. It's called a domestic violence home, or a home for the victims of domestic violence. You got to do something for somebody other than yourself. Why aren't you going to the Big Brothers, Big Sisters program to say, I got a little bit of time. Do I have enough to be a big sister or a big brother? Because one of the things that organizations like that are desperate for is men. So yeah, and then the thing I also wanted to say, Brother Mark, is that what Mary McLeod Bethune and Dorothy Irene Height so did, I think, that we need to nurture, is that they made that intersection, You heard me, Kimberly and Shaw, wherever you are. Between race and gender. They were race people, but they were gender people. And so when Dorothy Irene Height, for 40 years, plus the head of the National Council of Negro Women, when she sat at that table with the others, with the big six, all men, she brought her whole self. And she brought issues, not only of civil rights, but of women's rights. Sorry, that was a long response to your good specific question.
You are watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're again honored to have Dr. Johnnetta B. Cole here in studio with us. I want to talk about the late Donald Stewart.
Oh, I was hoping you would.
Who just passed away, and you know the headlines talk about him being the first black head of the College Board. You know him more personally as your predecessor at Spelman. Can you talk a little bit about how important Dr. Stewart was, and also the relationship you had with him as the baton was passed on to the first black woman president of Spelman College?
Well, I read the obituary in the New York Times, and I thought, here we go again. We got the last line. We got the last mention. But that's okay, because Brother President, as I always called him, was all of those things and a bag of chips. Now, as I prepare to go to Chicago for his, as our people would say, homegoing.
Yes.
Because now you know we don't use the word death, right?
Right.
And we'll tell you we're going to glory, we're making the transition.
Passed on.
We've passed on, but we don't use that word.
Right.
As I've been thinking about going to Chicago for that service, I really have lovingly thought so much about Brother President. Now, Donald Stewart had a rough time there at that particular point when Spelman women could not understand why all of those 100 years, it couldn't have been 100 because I was appointed after 107, but approaching 100 years at a black women's college, there couldn't be a black woman president.
Right.
So they locked him up with members of the Board of Trustees. But let me tell you how Brother President would go around introducing himself. If I was present, or if it was a setting in which Spelman was very present, he would say, I'm Don Stewart, the last male president Spelman College will ever have.
Wow.
And he could not have been more supportive of me. But let me also lift up some words for Isabel Stewart. They came there as a family. Brother President, first sister, as she should be called of Spelman, Isabel, little boys, Carter and Jay. And she was, for me at least, a message to Spelman women because she is an independent woman. The other thing I want to say about Brother President is he left that college, yes, with a higher endowment, with a raised reputation. But let me tell you what he left that college with. The Women's Research and Resource Center. Donald Stewart did that. Obviously, the good Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall and her colleagues carry it on. But to me, that is one of his greatest legacies. And when I think about what's going on across the HBCU community, I know what influence that resource center has. Full circle back to an earlier point, especially around gender-related issues.
I often think, just going back 15 years ago, when hip hop and gender, became a focus, and I think about those young women like Moya Bailey, now Professor Moya Bailey, who organized around Nellie to have these conversations. And what we all knew, those who knew Spelman as an institution and knew Dr. Guy-Sheftall, what we knew was that these were young women who had sat in those classes to be trained to do the kind of work that they did.
Yeah.
And I think we forget the fact that someone like Dr. Stewart had such a role. I mean, again, even bringing in so many Black women faculty who had PhDs, right, that changed the profile
Clearly.
of the institution.
Clearly.
You are here at Duke keynoting the Women Across Disciplines Symposium. How important is it for you these days to be able to connect with young women who are thinking about living a life of the mind, who don't know necessarily, even with all the struggles that they're dealing with now in the classroom with male peers and what have you, who really don't know the stories of so many women who come before them and the struggles they had to be able to even be part of a discipline, let alone to see themselves, right, across disciplines in this way.
Well, I want to say I really believe in this saying, you cannot lead where you won't go. And because I so believe in the importance of passing it on, of mentoring, of lifting up young women, I made a decision some time ago that I would do my best to never go to an event without making sure that I knew I had been responsible for bringing one of my mentees, somebody I am trying to learn from and to teach. So recently, when I was asked to receive an award from the National Women's History Museum in DC, they asked me who I would like to introduce me. I chose a Bennett College alumna, Marissa Jennings, who would relate so much to you because she is into this world of technology. Woo! I call her my techie guru. So I'm using that just as an example. Tonight, I made sure that an extraordinary young artist, Black woman, who also is now beginning to think about teaching and doing active work with art therapy. She happens to be a goddaughter, Zaina Allen, but I made sure that Zaina will be there tonight. Connecting back to an earlier conversation, this is what lifting as we climb is really about. So what I'm suggesting is that the role of education has always been central to us as a people, to any marginalized group. After all, it's the most consistent way that we're not only going to do better individually, but do better as a community. What's disturbing is some of the things going on around education now. The desegregation of our schools, the challenge to the humanities
Yes.
and the social sciences
Yes.
in our universities and colleges, the absence still of equity for people of color, the assaults still on LGBTQ folk in our academies, in our schools. So at the same time that education is our hope, we're seeing these days severe challenges to it.
We've been joined this morning by the legendary Dr. Johnnetta B. Cole. Dr. Cole, thank you for spending some wonderful time with us today.
Are you trying to tell me our conversation is over?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for all of your good work. In the academy, yes. At the Duke. But really also for the way over these 10 years you have reached so far beyond the academy, including with Left of Black.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything.